Okay, so we're going to start our discussion. And as a reminder, I am recording this so that we can share it with people who missed it later on. Can you guys see my screen? Good job. Thank you. So today we are going to talk all about skeletons. And you guys know the first part of this presentation because we go through our agenda for the day. So this is the plan for today. We're going to have an introduction. We're going to talk all about skeletons and answer some questions. We're going to go through our homework, our fun homework, and then I'm going to show you some resources for you or your parents to look at later in case you need to or want to. So introducing, I'm Megan and I'm Aiden and Lizzie's mom. And so if you're joining for the first time, I work at scientist.com. So I might work with your moms or dads, or maybe your clients or friends or relatives. And I have a background in science. So I went to college for something silly called poultry science, meaning I learned all about how to manage chickens and take care of chickens. And I also did some more serious science as well. So I really love animals and biology and science, and I like to share cool facts with my friends, and I love to teach. So that's why we're talking today. And you guys also know that you're out of school right now. And so maybe you're just starting some online learning and your teachers are trying to figure out how to still give you an education. But at the same time, your moms and dads are still working. So we're all working full time and we're also trying to be your teachers, which is kind of a lot sometimes. So I thought that it would be helpful for you to still get your education if I did some extra classes, because I was going to do this with Aiden and Lizzie and their cousin Ollie anyway. So I thought, hey, why don't we open it up to everybody so that you guys can all join? So now we're going to jump in and talk all about skeletons. And this topic was inspired by a book that I had when I was a kid, and it's an eyewitness book all about skeletons. And I thought it was so cool to look at all the different types, and I had lots of questions. So I asked Lizzie and Aiden what they wondered about skeletons, and we're going to answer some of those questions today. So the first is, what are skeletons? And skeletons, as you can see in this picture, this is a drawing of a human skeleton. So we're humans, so it's a person's skeleton. And skeletons are basically the bones that are inside of an animal, and they support our bodies. So if you think about it, if we didn't have any bones, we'd just be kind of a big bag of muscles and blood and stuff, and we'd just, yeah, we'd be boneless, and that wouldn't be great. We'd be kind of rubbery. So because our skeletons are there supporting us, they support our organs inside, our internal organs that we need to function and to live. And they also allow us to move. So if you think about it, if we only had muscles and they weren't anchored or attached to anything, how would we move? So our muscles work in conjunction with our bones and our ligaments and things to help us move. So right now, as I'm talking to you guys, I'm moving my jawbone, and I'm using my hands and my arms to talk. I'm gesturing, and so we're kind of moving all over the place, and we use our bones to breathe when we move our rib cage and our diaphragms that inflates our lungs. So bones are super important. They lend a lot of structure. They also do something else that's really cool and really important, and that is that they create our blood. So inside the bones is bone marrow, and that's where our blood comes from. So red blood cells and platelets and white blood cells. And I'll show you some more of that later. But skeletons have a very important function for humans and other animals. So next, we're going to talk about what animals have skeletons. And so when we think about it, we probably are thinking of what we call vertebrates. So vertebrates are birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish. We're vertebrates. Yep, you're right, Lizzie. We are vertebrates. And that just means a vertebrate has a backbone. So it's not just about having bones, but it's having a specific kind of bone called the spine or the backbone. And so our spines are made of all these little pieces in a row, and they're flexible and they help us move side to side and up and down. And invertebrates don't have those backbones. So they actually still have a type of skeleton, but they just don't have a backbone in their skeleton. So examples of some kinds of invertebrates are insects, or spiders maybe is a good example. Earthworms don't have a normal skeleton that we would think of, they're invertebrates, squids and jellyfish, and then crustaceans like crabs. Or if you think of mollusks like clams or snails, things like that, those also have a different kind of skeleton than a vertebrate skeleton.
Lizzie's crabbing.
I see you doing the crab, Lizzie. So what kinds of skeletons are there? There's actually a few different kinds. And the first one, when we think of skeleton, we probably think of an endoskeleton. And endo is just a word that means inside. So these skeletons are inside our bodies. And you can see in this example, there's a fish skeleton, there's a cow, a crocodile, and a chicken. And they all have these skeletons that are inside their bodies that we can't see. So what are these endoskeletons made of? So if you look at this bone, you can see this is kind of like a femur or a regular leg-shaped bone. And the bone is actually made of a bunch of different parts. But what happens is there's kind of a meshwork, or there's like a frame, and that is made mostly of cartilage, which is kind of like a flexible stuff. Like in the tip of our nose, we have cartilage, and on our ears, we've got cartilage up here, so you feel it's kind of firm, but it's flexible. That in our bones, in our hard bones, gets filled in with minerals or calcium. And that makes, with the calcium and the collagen and the cartilage, it creates a really hard structure that's also very strong. And it's made of kind of a almost stony material that's called calcium phosphate. And so it's hard, but it can also be brittle. So it uses the collagen, which is the like squishy, flexible part, to make it more, to make it stronger and a little bit flexible so it doesn't break as easily. Because if you think about it, if it was only hard and it wasn't flexible, it'd be kind of glass-like almost, and it could shatter. So the other parts that are in the bone help it continue to flex a little bit, because we don't want our bones to be like super mushy and flexible, but we need them to move a little bit so that they don't break when we do things like run or jump or throw a ball. So inside here, with that meshwork and the hard part on the inside, that's where the bone marrow that I was talking about is. So our bones aren't the same all the way through. And on the inside, there's nerves, which allow us to feel things. There's blood vessels that kind of feed the bones, so that there's blood flowing around, and the new blood cells that are being created there can flow back out to the rest of the body. So another kind of skeleton is an exoskeleton. And exo means outside. So an example of an outside skeleton is something like an insect would have, like a beetle or an earwig, or you can see a spider on here. Shrimp are also a good example. And then their exoskeletons are made of something called chitin. It's kind of almost like fingernail type stuff. And then some animals have a calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So calcium is also in our bones. And part of the reason we need to make sure we're getting calcium in our food, like by drinking milk and eating yogurt and eating certain kinds of vegetables, is because we're using that calcium to build our bones. And so these animals also have needs for calcium because they have shells for the snail or the scallop, or like maybe clams, that are made of calcium carbonate, which is pretty similar to what our bones are. So exoskeletons can also be made of chitin, like I mentioned with the insects. And the cool part of this is that it's basically like a meshwork or a framework. And I wanted to show this because you can see it's all these little strands that are kind of compacted together and formed in different ways. And when you take all those strands and you build them, and then you fill them in with calcium carbonate, which is really hard, then suddenly they become really, really strong. So the more calcium you add to this, the stronger and the firmer those exoskeletons get. The other skeleton type that I wanted to talk about is called a hydroskeleton. And you guys might know the word hydro, or you've heard hydra maybe, because it relates to water. So this is a flexible skeleton, and it's supported by something called fluid pressure. So it basically is a big tube of muscle, or kind of like a round bag of muscle, I suppose, that has blood and other fluids in it that help parts of it move. So in this example of an earthworm, you can see that they have a gut, or what their stomach and digestive parts are in the middle, and they have these circular muscles that go all the way around, and then they have longitudinal or long muscles that go down the length of their body. And then in here is fluid, and they control that fluid with the muscles and use that to move. So this question goes along with the previous one. Lizzie asked, why don't octopuses have skeletons? And they actually have a hydroskeleton. So the one we just talked about, that's actually muscle that's being controlled by fluids changing. So they're like pushing fluid around inside their body to change direction and things like that. So they don't have bones, but they have a hydroskeleton. And they do have one hard part of their body, which is called their beak. And their beak is in the middle of all of their little legs, and their beak is how they eat. So because they're not filled with bones like we are, they can actually squeeze through very, very tall or small, tiny holes and spaces. And there have been all sorts of crazy stories about octopuses escaping from their tanks or climbing out of boats and things like that, because they can go through very small holes because they don't have any bones. The only thing that limits them from doing that is their beak. And as I showed you before, the beak is in the middle of all of their legs, and this is where they eat. And it's called a beak because it looks like a bird beak, doesn't it? Kind of looks like a parrot. So if you imagine, this beak is situated in here, and they use it to eat. And so it's the beak of the octopus is made of stuff kind of like our fingernails are. It's pretty similar to that. And it's the only hard part of the octopus, and they are very strong, and they can use this beak to chomp through things like mollusks or snails, or they can chomp through the food that they want just using this little beak. So that beak part is the only thing that keeps them from squeezing through super tiny holes. They can only go through something that's bigger than the size of their beak. The next question we're going to talk about is, why do birds have hollow bones? And I know that Lizzie knows the answer to this because I really like birds and I like to talk about birds. So there's a couple of cool reasons, but the first thing I want to point out is that birds do have some hollow bones. And they have hollow bones because they need to fly. So they usually weigh less than solid bones because they have air pockets in them, but they're still really, really strong. So you can see there's cross structure in the middle to keep them from collapsing or breaking really easily. And this is a picture of it in real life. This is what it looks like. And where the human bone is all full of, bone and bone marrow, there's all these large air pockets in the bird bones. The thing is, not all of the bird's bones are hollow because they still have to make their blood somewhere. And remember how I showed you before that bone marrow makes blood? Well, birds need to have blood, right? So they have some bones that aren't hollow and that have bone marrow in them so that they can still make the blood that they need. So the other interesting thing is that these bones aren't all one big open space that's connected like pipes inside the birds. They have large air pockets, but they're not all connected to each other. So the idea is that they're strong, but they're also light so that the birds can get off the ground. So because of that, do you think all birds have hollow bones? Lizzie is right, they don't. So birds that need to fly generally have hollow bones, like this hummingbird here. And I picked this hummingbird because I thought it was very, very pretty. They have beautiful iridescent feathers, and hummingbirds are very tiny birds. So I have a feeder at my house for hummingbirds, and they come to visit, and the hummingbirds are about this big. And they have little teeny tiny feet and tiny bones, and they come up and they drink the nectar. But big, huge birds like this big old ostrich are called flightless birds. So flightless birds can't fly. Examples are ostriches or emus. Penguins can't fly. Kiwis, and there's actually kind of parrot that isn't able to fly. And they actually don't usually have hollow bones because they don't need to be as light. Yes?
Mommy?
Yeah.
Remember how the cat when she sees the hummingbirds in the window, tries to jump and catch them.
She sure does. She wants to eat those hummingbirds. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that Lizzie and Aiden had asked about, is, are human and animal skeletons similar? And this one I think is really, really interesting. So if you look at this chart, you can see this is all kind of what we would call our arm bones and how they relate to other animals. So you can see by the shading, like things like our fingers that are in yellow on there. Horses, cats, bats, birds, and whales all have also similar fingers, but they do different things. And that's called a homologous structure. So those are structures that are similar and in related animals. So the important thing to remember about those is that they share kind of like a common ancestor a long time ago. And so that means they're somehow related to each other, but you can see how they have the same type of bone, but something that is for a very different purpose. So like a whale still has finger bones, even though it's in that long kind of paddle-shaped arm. And similar to that, you can see the bat has these yellow bones in the finger that spread out to be the bat's wings. So similar bones can have different functions in different animals, but they usually all come from the same original structure. Another question that Aiden and Lizzie had is, what happens if I break a bone? So I thought this was really interesting, and this diagram was a little bit complicated, so it's more of a big kid diagram, but I wanted to point out what happens here. So you can see there's a fracture or a break in the bone, and our body goes, oh no, we know it knows there's a fracture, right? Because we have these nerve endings and there's lots of cells hanging around there that are doing very important work. And so they realize right away that there's this break and they go to work to fix it. So it forms a hematoma, which is kind of like a big bruise, basically. Lots of blood rushes to that area. And then the tissue starts to do something called granulation. So it kind of starts to firm up almost around that broken part of the bone. If you, a good way to say it is it's almost like blood jello. So you know how jello hardens as you put it in the fridge? Well, those liquids and things that are in cells around there start to kind of firm up and harden around the bone. And then they start to bring in new blood vessels to feed that part of the bone, because without blood flow, it would die off. Then cartilage starts to get in there, and eventually what happens is there's if you've ever gotten a callus on your hand, like maybe on your fingers from writing a lot, you get kind of a hard part of skin or a firm part of skin. You get a bony callus on your bone. So where that break was, there's kind of a little bubble almost of new bone that forms there. So it might be a little bit lumpy feeling, but actually that is really, really strong. So that part now of your bone is super strong. It's really compact. And then eventually some other cells in your body will come and kind of clean up the extra stuff that's hanging around there, but you'll have new bone that's formed at that spot. And that can happen even if your bones aren't lining up right. So that's part of the reason it's really important that if something happens and you think you've broken a bone, you should go to the doctor so that they can line it up and that it heals the right way. Because you can imagine if, say, I took my finger and I accidentally broke it sideways, and I didn't straighten it out, it could heal pointing the wrong way, and then I wouldn't be able to use it to point at you guys or to point at the screen. And we wouldn't like that. So the next question Lizzie had was about babies, and if babies have different bones. And the answer is actually that they do have kind of different bones. So when you guys were all born, you had about 300 bones in your body. And those eventually, by the time you're my age, they do what's called fuse, or they kind of grow or combine together to end up with 206 bones. So when you guys are born, when you were born, you had almost 100 more bones in your body than you do as an adult. And that's because as you're growing, the cartilage, or the soft, flexible stuff that's between your bones, is slowly being filled in by calcium and getting harder and harder to fill in. That usually finishes when you're about 25 years old. So your bones are still growing until you're 25. And I wanted to show this picture of this baby's skull, because you can see the skull especially is in these different pieces. And there's kind of soft cartilage in between. And then as you grow into an adult, that cartilage goes away, and then you have what's called a suture line, or it's kind of like a line where the bones meet, and it's this little squiggly parts on the top. And you can't feel those or anything, but when when babies are first born, if you see them and they don't have a lot of hair, sometimes you can see even their pulse through there, because it's just skin and a little bit of cartilage. But now as a grown-up, all the parts of my head are all firm, and they're all filled in with bone. So the next question that follows on from that is, how do the bones grow? And actually, when you're still in your mom's tummy, when you're right before you're born, the things that are going to be your bones are all basically little models of what they'll be eventually, but they're made out of cartilage. So they're all flexible. And they start to get blood vessels that are feeding them, and then they start to fill in with the hard stuff that actually makes them into bone. And then once you're born and you're starting to grow taller, so your bones are kind of like a little bit flexible, and they're getting harder and harder as you grow, but they're also growing longer in a lot of cases, right? As we're getting taller and taller and taller. And so there are actually plates or kind of lines at the ends of our bones that allow them to grow. So it's almost like it's an expansion point for them, where that's where all the new cells start to grow, and they start to fill it in, and then it stretches the bone out because it's filling out in the middle and stretching it along. And those plates start to close up as you get older, and they close all the way by the time you're an adult. So I'm not going to grow any taller, unfortunately, but some people can keep growing through high school even. Okay, so one more. I wanted to talk about fossils because I thought this was really cool. Bones and fossils are pretty similar to each other, aren't they? And this picture is Sue. And so Aiden and Lizzie have seen Sue. Do you guys know where Sue might be? Lizzie remembers. She's at the Field Museum in Chicago. And Sue is a T-Rex. What's that, Aiden?
I have a shirt from there.
You do. Sue is the biggest, best preserved T-Rex skeleton ever. And she is almost 90% complete. And you can see her if you go to the museum in Chicago. But I wanted to talk about how those fossils are formed. Uh-oh. Sue's in the way. Let's remove Sue. Hold on a second here. Bye, Sue. Okay. Sorry, Sue, you have to leave. So how do fossils form? So this is really cool, and this is how Sue formed. So when the animal dies, it sinks down into like the bottom of the water, maybe in like a lake or a bog or a stream. And then the remains, or the skeleton, gets covered with a bunch of mud and other stuff. And over time, more layers and more layers cover that, and they all kind of squish down. And as the bones start to decay or break down, the minerals in there actually gets replaced, and then they like get super, super hard. So the fossils aren't really bones anymore, but they're kind of like rock outlines of what the bones used to be, or of their old structure. And so then as layers above get worn away again, so they've all been compressed, and then as the wind and the rain starts to take those layers back off, that's when we can see little bits of fossils sticking up. So fossils aren't exactly skeletons, but they're kind of like real life models of what the skeletons used to be. Okay, so finally, guys, we're going to go over our homework. And if you come up with any other questions you have about skeletons, please send me an email and I'll try to answer it for you, okay? So today's homework for little kids under 6 is to draw a picture of a skeleton, the parts of a bone, or a fossil of some kind. If you're 7 to 10, you can draw a picture of an animal skeleton of any kind. You can make a comic about how fossils form. Maybe you can draw a comic about dinosaurs getting squished down into fossils, or you can write a few sentences about how bones grow. If you're in middle school, so Aiden, you're stuck with this one, you can write a paragraph explaining what happens when bones break and how they get fixed. You can draw your skeleton and label at least 10 of the bones, or you can create a comic book about bones growing, or a comic, not necessarily a book. And then if you're older than that, high school or parents, if Brian, if you really want to do homework, you can draw and label an ideal skeleton of your own choosing. So you can make it up and decide what you think it would look like and how it would work. And if it was only one type, like an endo or exoskeleton, or if it was all of them mixed together. Or you can write a short paper that describes one of the types of skeletons and explain how it functions. So then you guys know the deal. You email or have your mom or dad email or text the homework to me, and we'll put you in the drawing for the gift card. Thanks to scientists. They're paying for it, which is super nice that they're supporting this. And if you want some more resources, you can check out the slide deck and click on any of these. There's some interesting info about bird skeletons. There's a bunch of fossil stuff from National Geographic. There's a thing about bone growth and development, and then one about homologous structures, which, if you remember, are similar structures that have evolved in species that are related. So that is our homework for today. And thank you guys very, very much for joining. I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys next week. Rhea asked to learn about giraffes. So on Monday, we're going to talk about why giraffes are so tall.
Giraffe.